This is the story of an album being held up for over 15 years in between its inception and its eventual release. Along the way, I had two band members ghost me, and I had to replace one of them with Megadeth's drummer. Another singer vanished on me, but he eventually came back and finished the album. Another one before that was an incredible prima donna, and another one was also headed to federal prison and had to quit because of that. So these are just some of the topics we'll be covering. The album is called Utopia, and it's the debut by my band Black Halo. It was finally released a few months ago in February of 2026 as I record this, but the inception date was September of 2009. Now, I'd had songs lying around for a long time before that, and I just wasn't sure I was going to go forward with it, but that was when this project took off in earnest. This is the kind of twin guitar metal that I was writing right from the start in my teens as a guitarist. But in my 20s, I started doing instrumental guitar instead, and the reason I mention this is that those albums were released under my name, Randy Ellefson, and this was supposed to be the fifth Randy Ellefson album. Instead, it ended up being released under the band name Black Halo, although it is mostly still a solo effort. And one reason I mention that is that everyone who came onto this project knew that it was basically my show, and we weren't quite equals as creatives. At the time that this album kicked off in September of 2009, I was in an Iron Maiden tribute band. And I would end up going through 6 different singers over about 7 years, and that's the primary reason the album was held up for so long. But there was a guy I think of as kind of singer zero. He was the vocalist in the tribute band, and he had his own thing going, so he was never going to be the real singer for me because he had his own band. But he offered to do kind of like a test run on one of the songs upon deaf ears. And it's just as well that he was never going to be the guy because I didn't really like the way his voice worked with my material. But I don't count him among the 6 singers over 7 years, so I just wanted to toss that out. Most of the singers worked on both Upon Deaf Ears and Darkness Falls, partly because they were 2 of the earliest songs that I felt were pretty strong, but also the 2 that were complete and had someone who had actually sang on them. One of the things I always wanted was just to be one of the guitar players in a 2-guitar metal band and one of the songwriters and one of the people responsible for the direction of the band. But that has actually never happened over all these years. I've ended up doing most of the things myself, but I can't sing, so this was where this issue came up. But everyone who came in knew that it was my project. I'm basically the artist, the producer, the record label, the whole bit. Not because I want to be, but because often people drop the ball and I just ended up picking up the slack, and we'll see some of that in this. Now, unfortunately, since I can't sing, I couldn't deal with the vocalist issue. I'll also just say in general, I try not to dictate parts to people too much. If you're the drummer, I want you to bring your own style and put your own stamp on it, and this is something that would eventually have an effect on the way things went as well. Most of the songs on the album have a behind-the-scenes video for those, so I'm not going to go into detail about the individual songs too much in this video. As for the bassist, Dave, I first met him back in 2006 when I hired him as a session player to play the bass on my Some Things Are Better Left Unsaid album. And for the most part, those sessions went really well. But the thing about Dave is that he makes a living as a performing bassist. That's a combination of live performances, doing teaching, and just generally doing session work. So he didn't really want to join the band. Years later, I was in the Iron Maiden tribute band with him. He actually called me up and said they had everyone for it, but they were missing another guitarist, and he rightfully knew I would jump at that opportunity, so I did. So the 2 of us actually were in a band together performing live for a while. Now, as it turns out, that band had a lot of trouble getting shows, not because of us, but he told me a decade later we were too soon. You know, at the time he was telling me this, he said, today, tribute bands are all the rage, but we were a decade too early. We couldn't get shows, so we ended up disbanding. But it was around that time that I was working on this album, and I asked him if he wanted to play on it, even though I couldn't afford to pay him as a session player, so he agreed to do it anyway, but we would eventually change that arrangement. For the most part, he did a great job on this. There was a couple times where he had noise in his bass guitar signal. I don't remember which 2 songs those were, but he had to redo them. And I mention this because he was recording at home. So I wasn't producing his parts as much as some of the others. But of course, when he sent me something, I went through it and I gave him the feedback. But he was doing everything at his own home studio. Now, all that said, some of the bass guitar lines you hear him playing are actually written by me, and it's mostly because I consider those to be part of the song. The big one that comes up is Darkness Falls. Almost all of the bass guitar lines on that are actually written by me. As for the drummer, James, I first met him when my instrumental guitar band was trying to do some shows live between maybe 2005 and 2007, and it wasn't going very well. It's hard to get a show doing that, especially with it being very heavy and hard rock, sometimes metal. So at some point, my bassist quit because he was moving away, and my guitarist quit at the same time because he wanted to go back to being a drummer in a cover band. So I needed to replace both of them, and I found a bassist in the local band, and that guy was in the band with James. James was the drummer for that band, and he told me hey, you know, James is actually a very good guitar player. So long story short, James joined my band, my instrumental band, as a guitarist, even though he's the drummer on the Black Halo Utopia album. Now, as it turns out, when I was in that Maiden tribute band, the other guitar player wasn't working out for reasons I won't go into, but we had to let him go and we needed another guitarist, so we asked James, and so he joined the band. So this band, the rhythm section, which is me, James, and Dave, we did perform together. It's just with James on rhythm guitar instead of on drums. So we have been in the band together before. You sometimes hear about this thing, and I'm not going to compare myself to major bands, but you know, sometimes a band like Iron Maiden, I think they had done some shows with Nico McBrain when he wasn't in the band, and so that was how they knew him, and he ended up joining because of that. So sometimes bands that go on to be big, and hopefully we will, sometimes they end up knowing each other from the local scene and they get together, and that was what happened here. Any of you who followed my other stuff with instrumental guitar, you know I was working with another drummer. That guy at one point had been very good with double bass, but he didn't do that anymore, and I had been trying to get him to do it. He just wouldn't. He would always say something self-deprecating like, yeah, that's not going to happen. So I let it go on some of those albums, but I really needed it on this because it's more metal, and he was not really showing interest in doing it. And so at some point I asked James, do you want to do this? And he said yes. So I let the other guy go. James came on. James actually did all the drums here at my house, in my studio. And we used my electronic drum kit, which is actually sitting right here on my right. But at the time, what we were doing, we used his real cymbals because they sound better. And in fact, I just bought real cymbals for my kit, and I don't do the electronic cymbals anymore. They don't sound nearly as good as live cymbals. So James had the microphones and the boom stands for doing that. I just had to figure out how to engineer them so they sounded good. So all the drums on the album, I was the one who engineered them, and I also produced them. One of the funny things, I don't think I ever called James Thunder Thighs, but he was doing double bass passages, and I only had one kick drum, so he had to use a double bass pedal. And you know, a lot of drummers are used to that. I certainly am. But one of the funny things that would happen is that as he did any double bass passage, the kick drum would start to move across the floor away from him. So I would have to sit there in a chair and lean on this other side of it with both of my feet, with all my weight, to keep the thing from moving. So anytime you're listening to a song on the album and you hear James just going off with his feet, you can pretty much picture me leaning forward on that kick drum to keep it from moving. James was easy to work with, and one of the things that would often happen is after he did a passage and we let the cymbals fade out and I hit stop, we would sometimes both sit there not saying anything. And I knew from experience that what we were both doing is thinking something about that performance didn't work. But was it the performance and he just needed to try it again, or was it what he actually chose to play? And we would always be sitting there thinking about that. We would usually try it again. Almost every case of this, it was just the performance and he just needed to do another one. And I do this too, I'm not knocking him. It happens. Sometimes you just don't like the groove or something. If you were watching me make recordings, you would probably want to smack me at some point and say, what the hell was wrong with that? You know, and I'm sitting there going, I didn't like it. But you know, there's really nothing wrong with it. I'm just being, you know, finicky. The same thing happened with James and I. The problems began with singer number one. Most of the album was recorded between 2009 and 2011, and that includes like all my remaining guitar parts, the bass, and the drums. That was also the year and a half that singer number one was the guy. And the first issue with him was that he volunteered to write lyrics and melodies. It had been a long time since I had written lyrics, and you know, sometimes I was good at it, sometimes not so much. I think sign language, all those lyrics had been written. So the first issue was, though, he said he would do it and then he just never did. And at some point I basically had to take back the writing task of this. And I alluded to this earlier when I said that sometimes people would just drop the ball and I would have to take over. There's an old idea that if you want something done right, you have to do it yourself. In my case, it's often been if I want it done at all, I have to do it myself. This issue with him not writing anything became one of the bigger problems, and you'll see why. Another big issue was him just not showing up. Out of every 4 times he was supposed to, maybe he showed up once. So sometimes it was like 6 weeks in between him coming over. And it wasn't because he was sick and it was affecting his voice in any way. It was he wants to go to the beach or to a football game or to a cabin in the woods. You know, so I get it, I do these things too, but he had committed to the album and then he just wasn't doing anything because he wasn't showing up. And in the end, in 18 months when the rest of the band recorded everything, he had only done the vocals on 5 of the songs, and this was one of the major reasons. And even then, I would say maybe 2 of them were releasable. He probably still needed to redo parts of the other songs. Another big issue was just being unprepared. He came in the first time to work on Upon Deaf Ears, and he sheepishly admitted, I didn't even work on it. Now that's disrespectful of my time. He was not the kind of guy who could just hear something once and then sing it. So we would be working for sometimes 2 hours and he would say, man, I can't believe all we've done is one verse and a chorus. And I had to bite my tongue and say, what did you expect? This is what happens when you don't practice. So I basically had to sit there as he worked on it the first time. So it was kind of wasting a lot of time. Another big issue was half-assed performances. He was within arm's reach of me practically, and he's just phoning it in. And you could see and hear him doing this, partly because he often would sing a line, and then in the middle of it, he'd say, let's just do something else. So like the line, darkness falls, and I can hear your screams. The lyric may as well have been, darkness falls, let's just do something else. Because I'd actually be recording and have a recording of me doing that. He seemed to think he could just show up and improvise something and it would be good, but that's typically not the way it is. Maybe some guitar players like Eddie Van Halen can do that, and it's fantastic, but for the main melodies of a song, it's not usually going to work. Maybe if you're a great writer, okay, but I don't think that guy had any writing experience. So it just wasn't working, and he was purposely not trying, which again was disrespectful of the work that I had put in. And as if all of that was not enough, he kept insulting me. One of the things we all know is that we should make constructive criticism, but this guy would not only make destructive criticism, but he would make it unnecessarily personal. And there was a reason for this and everything else he was doing. So there was a kind of mystery to all of this. He would say stuff like, basically you're lazy. That's why the vocal melodies and the lyrics are no good. And this was, again, this is flat out insulting of the work that I've put in. And I thought it was interesting that he kept acting like he was going to save the day or something, and that he was the one who was super invested when he wasn't practicing. He was showing up unprepared when he was canceling all the time. And I'm like, okay, look, I'm the artist, I'm the record producer, I'm the record label. Why would I be the one who doesn't care? So it really didn't make any sense, and it was getting on my nerves. And I kept telling him, look, stop doing that. We're supposed to be talking about the vocal performances or the melodies and the lyrics, not about my personal faults as you see them. But as it turns out, there was a reason he believed it was okay for him to just say these things. And that's because in his view, me not caring was the reason none of that he was going to sing was good. But that wasn't the case. And there actually was a reason why he kept jumping to that conclusion, and the mystery was finally revealed at some point. You've probably heard the idea that perception is reality and seeing is believing, and these seem to be affecting him a little bit. And what I mean is that he never saw me or the other players putting all this effort into the songs. When he showed up and it was his time to work on something, everything was already done. So he acted almost like I went for a walk one day and a fully recorded song fell out of a tree, bonked me on the head, I picked it up and thought, wow, all I have to do is throw some half-assed melody and lyric on this and we're good to go. And that, of course, was not what was happening, but I think that's part of why he was so insulting. He just was taking everyone for granted, and not just me. One of the claims he liked to make was that all I cared about my guitar parts, and that explained the supposedly poor melodies and lyrics. And this is an old cliche that is not flattering. The idea is that if a whole band is in the studio when the album is being mixed, the drummer wants the drums louder, the bassist wants the bass louder, the guitarist wants the guitar louder. It's not true. Now, sometimes it can be, of course, but again, as the artist, I want what's best for the song, and as a serious songwriter, that's also true. So, again, the guy was not scoring any points with these comments. Now, as it turns out, there was one thing that explains all of his behavior, and I was quite upset when I found out about it. So, I have never made any claims that I can sing. I'm a bass baritone, which is one of the problems, because most singers in rock are tenors, or even high tenors, like Michael Anthony of Van Halen. And one of the issues here, though, is that I had the experience before where I write the melody and the lyrics, and I send them to somebody, and I might think it's obvious where the rhythm of the syllables goes with the rhythm of the melody. But then the guy gets it wrong and it doesn't sound right. And I think, if I thought you were going to do that, I would have rewritten the lyrics in a different way. So to ward that off, I would send him 3 different files. One of them was the entire song with everything but him for him to practice singing to. That was what he would hear when he would be here in my studio. The second recording was the same thing, but it also had all of the melodies played by me on lead guitar at the intended pitch level, because I can play guitar higher than I can sing. And sometimes I worked out the harmonies, and those were on there as well. So that was for him to hear what the melody actually was. And then with extreme reluctance, I made a version of the song. This was the third thing I sent him. I recorded the vocals, me doing a bad job of singing these. And I only did that so it was clear this was how I intended the rhythm of those words to go with the rhythm of the melody. And this was something I did to make life easier for us. And as it turns out, this was the problem. Every time I sent him a song, I said, whatever you do, do not first listen to the version of the song with me singing on it, because it's going to give you a bad impression of what the song is supposed to sound like. I could take Yesterday by the Beatles and convince you that this song is terrible, because that's how bad my singing is. Well, guess what? He was first and only once listening to the version of the song of me singing it and deciding, this is terrible. I'm never singing this. Randy's phoning it in. And he was right. I was phoning in the vocal performance because I could spend incredible effort doing a vocal performance and it was still going to sound like I was phoning it in. So it wasn't there to be some masterful performance. It was not really a guide vocal. He basically decided, I'm not going to sing this because I think it's terrible because of your singing of it. He wouldn't even try to take the version of it without me singing, and to take the melodies and sing them over the other track where there was no melody on there at all. So this was why he kept canceling. This was why he kept making insulting remarks. This was why he was unprepared when he did show up. Pretty much everything he was doing that was obnoxious was caused by this. And one reason I was so mad is that I made those recordings of me singing it to make it easier for us, and he flipped it around and used it as something that caused all of these problems. So I was about ready to kill him when I found out that he was doing this. Even once I knew this and I got on his case about it, I think he continued to do that kind of thing, so he still was just disagreeable. The 5 songs that he worked on were Upon Deaf Ears, Darkness Falls, The Core, Runaway, and then one song that was removed and replaced by Two Lights Beckon. And that was just in the 18 months. Now, in the end, he finally went too far with the insulting remarks. He finally seemed to realize how it looks that he's always canceling and all this other behavior. And he tried to assure me, hey, look, I want to get this done as much as you do. And I thought, I didn't say it, but I'm thinking, I really doubt that's true, but based on what I'm seeing. But I wrote back and said something like, okay, thanks for telling me what's going on, because I will admit I have wondered if you really want to do this or not. And well, that really pissed him off, and he sent me an email that was very rude. One of the opening statement was, you can question my motivation when you start paying me. Well, that made me really mad. I'll admit that I lost my cool on that opening sentence alone. The rest of it wasn't much better. And I basically sent him an email telling him off and setting him straight. And I told him to get a clue. And he basically saw that email and he's like, okay, I quit. And then he just started sending me all these emails with like paragraph after paragraph insulting me personally. And the last exchange we ever had was me saying, how many times do I have to say it to you? We're supposed to be talking about the vocal performances, the lyrics, and the melodies, not my personality flaws as you see them. But his whole thing was, you being lazy, that opinion was from those vocal performances I did. You doing a half-assed vocal performance is a sign you don't care about this at all. And it's like, you just stop. So basically he quit, and I wasn't really sad to see him go. I spent more time on this guy just because he was so obnoxious, and it's kind of interesting all the stuff he was doing. But the problems would continue with other singers. Each time a singer left, I had to find another one, and this usually took months. Now, as it turns out, I had no idea the album would be held up for 15 years. So I made one mistake, which was doing a photo shoot with me, the bassist, and the drummer. Now, obviously, I wasn't going to have the singer in this, but for the most part, I was going for those individual shots. We did do some group shots of the 3 of us just because we were there, but that was not really the point. These ended up being kind of useless because so much time passed. The bigger mistake I made was I had my longtime engineer, Drew, mix the album because I thought it would be done relatively soon. It couldn't possibly take that long to get a singer. Well, the issue there was that so much time passed that all of his hardware and his software that he used to mix the album had changed, and we basically had to start over. So I was not going to be happy with this, but there's nothing I could do about it. It basically doubled the cost of the album. Singer number 2 entered the picture at some point, and he lived on the West Coast, whereas I live on the East Coast, but he had his own studio. And I'm not going to reveal his name. He did go on to be a minor singer in the world of metal, and he has worked with other singers, and he has also worked with sometimes a well-known player from a big band. I won't name somebody here, but let's say there was a big metal band and one of the guys left and formed his own band and needed a singer. Well, this guy was sometimes the guy who sang on some of the stuff for these people. So maybe it was a mistake not to have him work on things, but one of the interesting things about singer number 2 is that he refused to audition. And I always wondered what the point of that really was, because if he was going to be the guy, sooner or later I was going to hear him sing on one of the songs, and that would effectively be his audition. And you'll see why I'm bringing this up. Now, he had a very strong, heavy voice, and I thought it was going to be great, but because of this audition thing, I didn't really know. And he said, we agreed that he would do the album, and he said he couldn't start for about 2 months. And then I said okay to that, but then one day he calls me and said, hey, I'm headed to federal prison, and I want to spend more time with my family first. And so I said, well, that I can't really argue with that. That's a pretty good excuse. And I don't know if he was telling me the truth, but the story he told me was that he worked for a real estate company, and they were doing fraud. and he had to fax something that, as it turns out, was fraudulent. And so he got indicted along with everybody else. And I don't know how the legal part of that works, but I would think you'd have to do more than just that to really end up going to federal prison for it, but who knows. So he was out. And I will say that he was extremely cool about trying to find me other singers. He was well connected. I don't know how he knew all these singers from around the world. I think it was from his band, and other people would reach out to him like he was their idol or something. And so he was forwarding me all sorts of guys. I must have auditioned at least a dozen guys, but none of them really worked. There did come a point where singer 2 and number 3 were in the picture at the same time. Typically what happened when someone contacted me about auditioning is that I sent them all the information they needed and one song for them to sing with. And I always chose one of the songs that singer number 1 had done. So that was part of why Upon Deaf Ears and Darkness Falls were the typical audition songs, because I didn't want to have a repeat of that experience where someone hears me singing and they go, it's terrible. So at some point I heard from singer number 3, it's Chase Breedlove. He would also be singer number 7, you might say. He's the one who came back and finished the album. So I sent Chase Darkness Falls, and there was a delay, of course, in between him getting the files and then sending it to me. And in that period, singer number 2 came back to me and said, hey, my date to report to prison has been moved back, so I can do the album after all. So I said, great, let's go. So I sent him Upon Deaf Ears and we started working on it. Then I got Chase's audition back and I thought it sounded great. But I said, sorry, man, I just committed to this other singer. And he said, okay, I get it. I'm disappointed, but I understand. So that was it for Chase. Well, then singer number 2, who had never auditioned, sent me a recording of him singing Upon Deaf Ears, and I immediately thought his voice did not work very well with my guitar playing. And I'm sitting there thinking, I think I may have just made a huge mistake. So I reached out to Chase and said, hey, are you still available? Do you still want to do this? And he said, yes. So I told singer number 2, I found someone else, I'm going with this other guy. And so he was out of the picture. This is when the album became a concept album. I had been aware of the possibility to turn it into one because of some of the existing lyrics. They seemed to be suggesting a storyline if I were to arrange them, and I added more songs and lyrics that worked the way that they could. Now, I don't know why, but the first 2 singers were really opposed to a concept album. I had brought it up to both, and they're like, no, concept albums are stupid. Now, I think they're good. I love King Diamond, so that ought to tell you right there. I think they're cool. But Chase was all about the idea of a concept album. So the story is all mine. He didn't really have an input on that, but he was all in favor of doing it. And I would end up adding some new songs to go with this. One of them was In Death I Linger On, which was an old song I had written in my teens. I just made some changes to that. I added A Kiss From Beyond, and then I ended up pulling off Farewell later and adding Two Lights Beckon. And there was another song called Haunted, which sounded a little too much like In Death I Linger On as far as the treatment, so I decided to pull that off later. During all the years that the album was held up, sometimes songs went on, they went off. There actually was an instrumental called Defying the Siren Call that was on there that got yanked. So the Double Vision cover was supposed to be part of the album, but that didn't go with the storyline, so it eventually got pulled off as well. So singer number 3, Chase, he was great to work with right from the start, but the same thing kind of happened with him twice. Now, he lives in Atlanta, or somewhere near Atlanta in Georgia, and I live in Maryland, so we agreed he would record at home, but he was only doing demos at the time. We were going to figure it out later how we would do the final vocals. I would probably have to pay for him to go to the studio, but we were going to worry about that later. So we were just kind of working out all the vocal lines. And one of the issues that came up here was that he started working diligently. So let's say I email him once and he responds. Well, as time went on, I would have to email him 3-4 times before I get a response. He started sending me stuff back more slowly, and so it seemed like he was just kind of falling off. And at some point it came to a head, and I talked to him about it, and he said he really needed me to push him more. And at the time I got the impression that which he later confirmed, was that he was having some personal troubles that I won't go into, probably because he didn't tell me and it's not my business, but those were kind of impacting his ability to stick with this. But that said, he was not like singer number 1, who kind of had an attitude. Chase was always very nice. I always liked working with him. I thought his voice went perfectly with my guitar playing, and he was proving right from the start that he was creative. But what happened is he was kind of fading away. And so when we talked about it, and he said he needed me to push him more, I said, okay, I can do that. So he went back to working a little more diligently, but the same thing happened again. And this time it got to the point of him ghosting me altogether. He just was disappearing, not responding to me at all. And one of the reasons this was so upsetting is that he was creative. As I mentioned before, I've often had to take on the role of something, and at some point, Chase had heard the music for the title track, Utopia, and he said, I have an idea for vocals. I'd love to take a stab at this if you're okay. I said, yeah, but here's what the song is supposed to be about. I had never written vocal lines for that song or lyrics, but I knew what the subject was, and it was supposed to be the opening song, partly because of the intro. And so Chase sent me back the final vocals and lyrics, and I thought they were great. So I was stoked that I finally had a guy who was creative and who would step up and who would say he would do it and actually do it, and it was great. So I was very excited about this, and then that became painful when he was slowly disappearing on me. So, I think in that song I just changed a few of his lyrics, but otherwise it's all him. So eventually I had to let him go, and one of the things that can happen to any of us is that if we see something's happening, like it's a relationship's falling apart, and we try really hard to prevent that, it is actually so much worse when it finally happens anyway, despite all of our efforts to prevent it. So it kind of left a big mark on me. It's almost like I never really got over the loss of Chase, because I felt like I had my guy, not only for this album, but maybe my whole career, for decades, just not having someone like this. And I finally got him, and then he's going away. I would eventually joke to him that he probably thought I just wouldn't take a hint that he was disappearing on me. And I told him, I knew you were going, I just refused to let it happen, or I tried to. So it's not that I couldn't see what was happening. He was the singer for about 16 months. And at this point, it had been about 4 years. The first singer was 18 months, the second guy on and off for 6 months. Now it's 16 months with Chase, and I'm having to start over every time. So at this point, I've got a bit of an attitude about the whole thing. The bassist recommended singer number 4, and this guy was local, but he had his own recording studio, and like a lot of guys who have invested in their own gear, he refused to record somewhere else. And I totally get that. I have my own stuff. If you said, hey, I gotta drive an hour to get to your place to record, I'd say, why? I can just do it here. And there are reasons to be in the same room, but this may have been what doomed this guy. After his audition, he said he would send me a finished song every 2 weeks, and after 6 months, I fired him for doing nothing. And it wasn't because I waited all the time. I kept asking him what was going on, and he kept saying, oh yes, I'm working on it. So he basically strung me along. Whether that was intentional or not, I don't know. I don't really care anymore. But after about 6 months, the bassist called me and said, hey, how's it going? Because he had recommended this singer. And I told him what was going on. And he said, okay, let me go call the singer to see what's happening. And the story he told me was that for some reason, another family had to move into this singer's house and into the room that he used to record. So he wasn't able to do it. And instead of just admitting that to me and saying, oh, hey, I'll come over to your place and do it, he didn't. I think he was hoping the situation would resolve, but it wasn't resolving. So he just ended up stringing me along. And I finally told the bassist, I said, look, I don't want to hear again, yeah, I'm going to work on it. He's been telling me that for 6 months and nothing's happening. And it's happened with other people, and I can't take it anymore. So I think the bassist knew, yeah, I'm done with this guy. So I never heard from the guy again. That was it. So singer number 4 never did anything after his audition. Singer number 5 lasted about a month. He was not quite a crooner, but he had a soft voice, and I wasn't really sure he was going to work on the heavier stuff, but he sounded really good on Darkness Falls. He was also local and came over to work on that. And after a month, though, he said he has to quit because he doesn't have the time. What had happened, the story he told me, is that he ran a construction company for corporate clients, and one of them had just stiffed him on a big job, and now he had to take the time to sue that company. And in addition, he had to pay his staff from his own savings, and that meant that he had to get a second job as well to be able to afford any of this. So yeah, that was a good excuse. So, no hard feelings. I don't even remember what that guy's name was or what he looked like. I would recognize him if I bumped into him on the street because he was involved for so little time. The bassist also recommended singer number 6, who was again local and he could record at my house, even though he was maybe an hour away. The drummer chimed in and said, yeah, this guy sounds really great, let's do it. So, at the time, the bassist and the drummer were involved in helping me find other people. And this would end up changing later. But as far as singer number 6, this guy was so cooperative that it was actually a negative. And I know that sounds weird, but hear me out. Singer number 1 was so difficult that you would think, how can I complain about someone being so cooperative? Well, if you've ever seen The Princess Bride, the main character, Wesley, keeps saying, as you wish. Well, this guy kept saying, whatever you want. So if he sang a vocal line and it didn't sound right, I would say, hey, can you try this or that? And he'd just say, whatever you want. But then he'd just kind of look at me, like expecting me to do what I ended up having to do, which was turn on my keyboard and pick up a guitar. I had to write every variation for him to try. And he would faithfully sing it, but if that didn't work, I was again on the hook to come up with another variation for him. And the reason this is a negative is that there is a lot to be said for just improvising. And in the case of a singer, just open your mouth, sing the basic melody, but let your ear guide you to things that work better for your voice or whatever. and he wouldn't do that. So whatever musicality he had, it was kind of like he wasn't willing to use it. And I think this ended up dooming him because the vocal performances were kind of subpar, and I hate to offend the guy, but you know, that was true. And eventually the bassist, I think, was the first one that sent me an email, because I would send the guys, you know, MP3s every time the singer finished the song. And so I think it was the bassist who said, you know, I don't think this is turning out the way I thought it would. His voice is not as strong as it used to be. It's not where I expected, and I don't think it's turning out good. And the other guy said, yeah, I've been meaning to say something, but I totally agree. And as soon as they said it, I just kind of hugged my head because I knew they were right. And the problem is I was desperate at this point. It was now 2016, so 7 years into this. You know, at this point, the guy had worked on the album for about a year, and now I was the one who pulled the plug on him. And I kind of felt bad because now I had wasted his time, whereas a lot of the other people had wasted mine. And that guy was kind of funny because he refused to use like a modern cell phone or email or text. So I always had to arrange things through his wife. And so when I emailed her and I told her, I don't think I ever got a response back. So I don't know if that guy wants to slug me or what. By this point, I went on hiatus with this album. I really just could not take it anymore. And one of the things that had happened is that with this being the first album with vocals on it, and there was nothing for me to do as a guitar player on it because I was done way back in 2011. You know, 5 years earlier, I went back to working on my instrumental stuff, and I finished 2 more albums and released them in 2013 and 2014. And I actually recorded a bunch of other stuff that's going to come out on some other albums, you know, some of which will be Black Halo. But I had recorded all this stuff, and I really just didn't have anything else to work on anymore, and I just decided to retire. Now, I never forgot about this album, and I did want to return to it, but man, I needed a break. Another issue is that I started going through my own personal troubles with my divorce and my custody fight. Another issue is that I am also an author, and in order to focus on music, I had to stop writing books. Well, now I kind of reversed that and went to do more books and put music on the back burner. And eventually, around 2022 or so, I made the decision I'm going to just do both all the time. Not really worried about trying to make a career so much as I just need to feed all my creative soul, because I'm always sort of miserable if I'm not doing one or the other. I got to do both, even if it slows me down for both of them. Now, I have an unfortunate tendency to sometimes prematurely announce something, but this time it came in handy. I think it was right at the beginning of 2023, I made an announcement on my Facebook page for me as a musician, because I have one as an author as well, that I was returning to doing music and that I was hoping to get that vocal album done. What I did not know is that singer number 3, Chase Breedlove, was still following that page, and he saw the announcement. He reached out to me and said, hey, look, my life has calmed down now. I'm past everything that was going on. Things are good. I hate the way things went down between us before. I would love to do this, you know, give it a shot again. But I understand if you don't want to do that, given what happened before. You know, I'm paraphrasing what he said. And he was always the one who got away. And so I was kind of excited, but sort of muted excited because of what happened before. But I remember thinking, it's the beginning of the year. I wasn't going to start looking for a singer until the summer, so it can't hurt. If he doesn't do anything between now and summer, I'll just go look for somebody else. So, well, as it turns out, he did get it done this time, not in just 6 months, but, you know, he was starting to work on things. We worked it out where this time he had a house now, and he had a space to convert into a recording booth for himself. So we worked out how we were going to do this. So everything was a go. And when I told the bassist and the drummer, they didn't really have the excitement that I had. But then again, my own excitement was kind of muted. By this point, it had been over a decade since the bassist or the drummer had worked on things, and that was about to have another impact on how this album would go. Now, one of the things I've always liked working with Chase is his creativity, and he once again proved up to the challenge. There were times where I didn't really like some of my lyrics or my melodies or both, and I would sometimes ask Chase, hey, do you want to take a shot at this? And he would say yes every time, and lots of times what he gave me, that was it. He fixed what I could not, and I loved it that it wasn't all on me, so this was awesome. Again, he was proving that he was the guy. Now, both of us are adults with families, and it took over a year to get the vocals done. I think he was recording on Mondays and Thursdays at the time, and so he would send me stuff on Monday, and I was at pains to get him detailed feedback by Thursday morning so he could record again, and then he would send it back, you know. So that was how we did things. We both used Pro Tools, which you see over my shoulder here, to make it easier for this, and we had our whole setup worked out, and everything was moving along pretty good. Every time a song was finished, I sent it to Drew, my mixing engineer, and he did a new mix of it. At this point, I had already found out we had to start over. Was not happy, but it is what it is. Now, one of the things that happened is that I sometimes went back and forth about this being a concept album. At this point, I was still kind of desperate. I had lost any chip on my shoulder, but I still just wanted to get this done. And I had made a decision. If Chase only sings 3 songs and gets them done and then he goes away again, I'm not starting over. I'm just going to have, if I have to do one of these albums where every song has a different singer, then so be it. I just want it done. I can't do that anymore. The starting over was the big issue. So at the time I thought, well, I'm not going to worry about it being a concept album. But as the months went by, it became apparent Chase was sticking around and it was going to work out. And so we went ahead with it. But during the time when it wasn't the concept album anymore, I told Chase I really don't like my lyrics and melodies on the song that is now called Darkness Rises. So he worked on that song and sent it to me, and it was great. But the lyrics were not written in regards to the storyline because it wasn't the concept album at the time. And that's part of why that song got pulled from the album and is now a bonus track. It was at this time that I finalized the storyline and started rearranging the songs, and some decisions were made about pulling off one thing or another or adding something. And one of the issues, and that I think is funny in this album, is that at the time most of it was recorded. My son was not even conceived, not to mention born. And by the time the album was released, he was 13. Now at the time, in 2023 or so, he was about 10 or so. He had become a pretty good drummer, and he and I would jam, and I sometimes wrote songs accidentally by jamming with him. And one of those was Two Lights Beckon. So I ended up adding that to the album and pulling off the last song that was there instead. The first song that Chase finished was Upon Deaf Ears, and when I got the mix back, I sent it to him and to the bassist and the drummer. And I don't think the bassist responded at all. The drummer did, and I think this might have been when he decided to drop out and have no more interest or further involvement in the album. And he basically said to me that he wanted to redo all the drums on the album. And this was not a good thing to say to me. If you consider the bass, vocals, drums, and guitar 25% each of the 100%, well, the album had been stuck at 75% for over a decade, and now I'm making that final push to 100%, and he's talking about going back to 50%. Not only the vocals being done finally, but redoing all the drums. And it was kind of like giving me a heart attack to just hear that. I was like, no, man, I can't do that. I also had trouble with my time management, just getting Chase responses to his vocals. And I didn't have time to also do this with the drummer. So another issue was that the drummer had moved away several times, and he no longer had access to a studio. So he suggested we use the electronic drum kit again, including the electronic cymbals, which to me was a big step backwards from the live cymbals we had used. So I'm like, no, I don't want to do that. And he also said his justification for this was that he was a different drummer today and he would have done things differently. And I immediately thought, well, you were the drummer that I needed at the time. I love what you did on this. So if you're a different drummer now, then you're not the guy. So I basically said no, and he kind of ignored that, and he did a workup of something. I never listened to it. He sent it to me, and I never listened to it or responded. And after that, he basically never responded to me again. This was in 2023, and by September, I had sent them both several more songs, one of which was the core, and I asked the bassist if he wanted to do background vocals on this, and he said yes. So I took the time to prep a session for him, and I sent it to him, and he never even downloaded it, and not to mention did it. So one of the things that I began to notice was that neither the bassist or the drummer were ever downloading the files I sent them. And I knew this because I was using a file transfer service, because these were not MP3s, but they were WAV files. Those are too big to email. And one of the side effects of that transfer service is it would tell you that so-and-so just downloaded this. Chase would always download a mix, neither the bassist or the drummer would. And that was especially apparent given that two of them were never downloading anything. And it's not that it bothered me so much as, to me, the bare amount of interest you could show in something that you worked on is to actually listen to it. And so if you're not willing to do that, then I don't see you showing up for a photo shoot, which they had done before, or doing a promo, if there's a video shoot. So it really just started to seem like they're not interested. And to some extent, over a decade had passed, so it wasn't really that hard to understand. I mean, even I had retired from doing this at one point. But I also started to think more and more, I may have to just move on from both of them. The bassist never downloaded another song until the spring of 2024 when he downloaded the Foreigner cover. And I thought it was noteworthy that the guy who makes a living playing in cover bands was interested in the cover, but he wasn't downloading any of the original music. And while I had his attention, I said, hey, do you want the other songs as well? And he said, yeah. So I sent it to him and he never downloaded them. At that point, I decided I was basically done with the bassist. And as the same with the drummer. I hadn't heard from the drummer in, I don't even know how many months. It was probably the previous summer, and that was the following spring. So as many as 9 months, I hadn't gotten a response from the drummer. Every time a song had been mixed, I sent it to them, and they just never downloaded. By maybe early summer of 2024, I knew that I needed another drummer to do the drums on Two Lights Beckon and on the Death That Linger On, and I found out that Megadeth's drummer, Dirk Verbeuren, was actually available. And at the time that I emailed him, he was on a break in between Megadeth tours, on different legs of the tour, and I thought he's probably, even if he says yes, it's probably going to be after the next tour. Well, he actually did it just 2 weeks after I emailed him. He was so quick. So that was very cool. One of the problems there was that he was expensive though, so I did realize I can't afford to hire a bassist. So I just did the bass on the new songs myself. And one of the reasons for that too is I don't feel like I need a bassist on my acoustic material besides myself. And then Two Lights Beckon, the rhythm guitar is so aggressive, there wasn't a whole lot of room to do anything but just follow it anyway. So I figured, okay, it's no loss there. Another issue or a funny thing that happened with Dirk and the drummer, my other drummer, James, on the day that I finished with Dirk and we finalized all the arrangements, I paid him and all that, I heard from the drummer for the first time in almost a year. He said that he had just moved within 5 minutes of me, and I thought, well, gee, I wish he'd said that a couple of weeks ago. You could have done the drums on the remaining songs, but I didn't tell him that actually. But but he still was not asking about the album. He just asked me, do I know a rehearsal space nearby? And I said no. So he still didn't really show any interest in the album. By the middle of 2024, I now knew I was releasing the album under a band name, and I knew which band name it was. And I had even drawn the logo. Now, I can't draw to save my life any more than I can sing, so I hired a guy off of Fiverr to take my poor sketch and turn it into something, but I reached the limits of his ability to realize my idea. And as it turns out, I'd worked with a lot of cover artists, partly for my books, and I reached out to the British woman who did my novel Death Singer, because I knew she had done logos before, even though she didn't do it anymore. And I said, would you be willing to do this even though you don't do that anymore? And she said, yeah. And I showed her what I was doing, the mock-ups and all the stuff I had, and she said, I totally get what you're going for. And I wasn't sure to believe her, but yeah, she got it. What you see over my shoulder, that was exactly what I had in mind, and that was the first thing she sent me. And my God, that's exactly it. So after all that work with the guy from Fiverr, I got it in one shot with her. I knew that Chase is religious and he might take exception to the horns and the tail. And he did say something to me about that. And I wanted to respect his views, but he eventually just kind of let it go. I did point out, look, it's just a logo. It doesn't mean we're Satan worshipers or anything like that. So hopefully the days of bands being accused of that kind of thing are over. Now, I needed a woman to sing in Death I Linger On, and I found Beck Hallcraft off of a website where you can hire singers, and I immediately thought she was great. I talked about her contributions to the vocal lines in the, well, not the vocal lines, but her vocal performances in the behind the scenes video on that. So she was pretty quick. Once she got over a cold, she did it, and I was super excited with the work she had done. By the end of 2024, the album was almost completely done. The last thing I think was done was a guitar solo on Two Lights Beckon. Now, it had been a long time since I'd done a solo. I was back to playing guitar more regularly at that point. But I'm going to go ahead and say I still got it because I thought that solo turned out pretty good. It's actually one of my favorite ones on the album. So it was nice to get that done. But one of the issues with Two Lights Beckon is that the album needed to be reamped. Now, let me explain what this means. Not the album, actually, just that song. So the way I record things, I record the raw signal of my guitar into my studio here, and then it goes through an amp simulator. So the amp simulator is not recorded, just the sound of the guitar, which then goes through it. So I hear it as if it's being recorded, but it's not. And what that means is that you can reamp that. You can take the signal from the studio and send it out you can either change the amp simulator settings, or you can send it out into a real amp. And this is what we did. I would take my stuff to Drew. We would send the signal out of the studio into my guitar amp. He had the microphones in front of it. We would record it and back into the studio. So this is called reamping. And the whole album had already been reamped a decade earlier, and now I needed to do Two Lights Beckon. And one of the funny things for me about this is that I thought, it's probably going to sound different. It's been so long, and I did it on a white 7-string guitar that originally belonged to my son. And so I thought it's just going to sound different, and I was surprised how much it sounded the same. And Drew even said to me, well, it's your guitar tone. And I thought, okay, well, that makes sense. If you don't know anything about guitar players and tone, the tone really comes from the player, not from their gear. It's a common misconception that it's the gear. And of course, that is used to advantage by marketers who, like, let's say you want to sound like Eddie Van Halen, and who doesn't? You say, oh, buy this, this gear that Eddie has, and you'll sound like Ed. You're not going to sound like Ed, no matter what you do. Even if you're physically capable of playing everything perfectly, you're still going to just sound like you. By early 2025, the album was actually fully mixed and mastered, and I could hardly believe it. It had been more than 15 years. So So this was a big deal for me. This was also when I sort of formally ended the relationship with James and Dave, the drummer and the bassist. Basically, they had been acting like session players, and what that means is that typically you hire a session player to record their parts and you pay them and that's it. They go and they're done. That's what both Beck and Dirk were. So, they were paid for their time, they have no further involvement, and they're not expected to have any further involvement. If they decide to do a little promo, that's a bonus, and Dirk actually would go ahead and tell his fan base, and that was very cool of him, but it's not required. So if an album goes on to make nothing, they get nothing, and if it goes on to make millions, they get nothing. That's the way a session player typically is paid. There are obviously changes or variations to that. Well, the bassist and the drummer were not on that kind of arrangement with me originally. They were going to get a percentage of profits as if they were part of the band. But I decided I don't want that to be the case anymore because they're showing no involvement or interest in doing this. And as I sit here, I don't think either of them have ever publicly acknowledged that they are on these albums. They have not added them to their discography. So I thought, I don't see why they should get a percentage when they're acting like session players. So I wanted to formalize the session player arrangement. So I wrote up agreements and I sent it to each of them and I said, this is what I want to do, name your price per song, and we'll just handle it that way. They both signed it, and that was kind of the end of that, and the two of them were out of the picture. I don't foresee either of them coming back at any time, but you never know. But I figure, if you're just going to act like a session player, let's make that the case. And it was partly for my own benefit to not expect anyone to step up and do anything, given that they weren't doing that. By contrast, Chase was stepping up repeatedly. I had an album cover at one point. I didn't really like it, neither did Chase, and he offered to do another one, and so he did the final album cover. There are things on, it's called Spotify Canvas. He made up a lot of the Spotify Canvas videos for us. So Chase has been willing to step up, and one of the funny things about this is that in the beginning, the bassist and the drummer were the ones who just did everything as needed, and the singers were the problem. Fast forward a decade, the singer is the one stepping up and doing things, and the bassist and the drummer are not doing anything. So it is what it is, but it's always been my solo project, and that's how I went forward with it. It technically still is, it's just that Chase is on a different arrangement I won't go into, but I do consider Black Halo to basically be me and Chase at this point going forward, and we've both expressed our interest in doing further albums. Now, as it turns out, after all of that, there was still one last hurdle. I just couldn't seem to catch a break. Well, as it turns out, my employer went bankrupt and out of business, and I had lost my job by the time the album was done, so now I have no budget to release it. I had to worry about paying my mortgage. The last thing you want to do going into releasing an album is having no promotional budget. You could just put it out there, but I can tell you, even with the promotional budget, it's really hard to get eyeballs on it. There are so many songs being, well, not eyeballs, but ears. There are so many songs being released to streaming platforms every day. I think it's something like 1 million. So it's crazy hard. So if you've watched this video, if you like the band, please tell your friends about it. Do some streaming yourself. Please consider buying an album. This album cost me over $10,000. It was all on me personally. Ask yourself, do I have $10,000 to spend on something? Probably not. I don't. It's just something that happened. It is what it is, but so I'm hoping at some point to recoup. Certainly that will help us bring you more albums. I do have a lot more recorded. So please support not only Black Halo, but other independent artists. If you have a choice between buying the latest Metallica and buying our album, please buy our album or another independent artist album. Nothing against Metallica, but those guys are loaded. They don't need your money. The independent artists, we do. So thank you so much for supporting the band. And please like this video, subscribe, and keep rocking.